Welcome to the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns. My co-host is Caitlin Drake, who uses the female pronouns she, her, hers. Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. Over the coming months, we will be sharing a series of episodes featuring conversations with LGBTQ+ Christians as well as leaders of resistance to the traditional plan in Oklahoma. As we lead up to General Conference 2020, and as the United Methodist Church continues to deny full inclusion of LGBTQ+ peoples, we feel it is especially important to lift up these voices and experiences. Today, our guest is Reverend Jay Williams, an associate pastor and youth director at Mosaic United Methodist Church. Hello, Jay.
Hello, Philip. My pronouns are he, him, his.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about your faith journey?
Yeah, so growing up, I come from a family that is primarily Baptist, Black Baptist, and this, in my family, my mom was a single parent, so she worked often 3 jobs at a time, so we never really had time to go to church as a family, so I kind of started venturing out on my own, was baptized in the Baptist church, and then slowly ventured into the Methodist church, where I encountered my first ever female clergy person. And something about that just felt so right. So I stayed. And when we moved from one town to the next, I intentionally sought out another United Methodist church. And so my faith from that point on, going through confirmation, going through different camps, it all just came together in the Methodist church.
When did you feel your calling to enter ministry?
Yeah. So this might be a longer story. Is that okay? Okay. So when we moved into the Methodist church, my siblings and I, we started going, attending, and I got pretty involved at a pretty young age. And I guess the leaders recognized leadership skills in me that I had not recognized yet. So I kept participating, started going to the camps, started with district camp, then I ended up going to leadership camp, and all of those different things. But it was actually at camp that I experienced my call to ministry. I think that's common for a lot of young folks in Oklahoma. But I just kept feeling this urge. People would tell me often that, God, to listen to God and to listen for that voice. And so I did some soul searching, and one of the heaviest things on my heart is, again, I came from, a socioeconomically just a poor socioeconomic upbringing, and that kind of affected my outlook on life. I wanted to get out of that. I wanted to make as much money as possible, support my family, that kind of thing. And so ministry was just not in the cards. Like, there was no way I was going to make enough money to become rich in ministry. So I kind of just counted that out altogether. But slowly but surely, year after year, I kept hearing this call. People kept, leading me back to God's voice speaking to me, and eventually I one day just surrendered. God and I made a promise, and I think that God spoke to me that God would provide for all of my needs. And speaking with one of my pastors after that, I had a conversation with her, and her words to me were, Jay, I understand, and I can tell you, in ministry, you won't make a lot of money. That's just true. But the greater reward, being in partnership with God, being able to lead people to God, that's the greater reward, much more so than any financial gain in the world. And so that just kind of spoke to me and opened my eyes. And so at that point, that's when I started really taking it serious. And from that point on, I jumped in full force and became a young leader in the Methodist Church.
So you mentioned your socioeconomic background and your background coming from a family of predominantly Black Baptists.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of all of that speaks to a larger piece, which is identity and your identities. So can you tell us a little bit about some of those pieces of yourself and maybe how it intersects with your life in the church?
Yeah, for sure. I think that especially as I've ventured into the School of Religion at Oklahoma City University, I've just learned so much about different theologies and different ways we interpret Scripture, and I realize that a lot of the way that I view the world comes from that sense of identity. It comes from, being on the margins of margins, coming from a poor family, obviously being Black, being LGBTQ, and seeing all of those injustices that we as communities face, and reading Scripture kind of like my ancestors understood Scripture as to be liberating, to be freeing, and so that's kind of how my identities have played a role into, how I view the church and how I view the world. And particularly, it's kind of hard in the United Methodist Church. We have different outlooks. I think that our church is obviously predominantly white, and I think predominantly middle class, very opposite of what I am. And so I think that just kind of weighing those two things, but also trying to find a balance in my life, and being in community with the church, bringing in my different identities, I think will help the church in the long run. I think it will help the church, just become more inclusive, hopefully, and kind of think about the ways in which we engage the world, particularly those on the margin.
So looking through that lens of your LGBTQ identity, obviously well, not obviously because this is an audio podcast, but you're visibly Black.
Mm-hmm.
Being LGBTQ is not always a visible identity that we wear. And so for a lot of the LGBTQ community and in the history of that community, coming out is a part of being visible
Sure.
with your identity within the church or within the world and then within the church. So based off of your Resist Worship Service sermon, I know that you have a fairly iconic coming out story
Yes.
within the church. So I was wondering if you would share that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. First, I would like to say, though, I think that, yes, there's no true, coming out for African Americans, that kind of thing. It's visible, like we discussed. But for LGBTQ people particularly, you never really stop coming out. Like there's always that, even in my own life, I struggled with, do I need to tell my SBRC chair? Should I, inform my district superintendent? And so you think about all of these things constantly. And so I think that plays into a big part of, identity as well. And that constant fear of being discovered versus, outing yourself. But the moment I started living authentically in my life was at church camp. First, I had, queer people never really stopped coming out, but I came out to a close group of friends one year, came out to the school, and then at one point in life, I decided that I wasn't going to go into ministry if I wasn't going to be able to be authentic with who I am. I owed it to God, and I owed it to my ancestors, and I felt like I owed it to myself to live authentically. And so, I was the co-dean, the youth co-dean at a leadership camp here in Oklahoma, and it was the last day of camp, and I was charged with preparing the devotion for that evening, or for that morning rather. And at that time, I just knew that it was appropriate for me to come out to this group. Before that, I had come out to the leadership that I was involved with, both youth and adults, and they encouraged me along the whole time. I remember one of the leaders there said, if you need me to stand up with you while you give this message, I will do that. And this was before I even knew where anyone stood on either side. But yeah, so I decided that it was time to come out, and I did so at camp. And shortly after I came out, I get a call from my district superintendent at the time, and obviously I'm still a youth at this point, so no true pastoral role yet in the church. But the district superintendent knew that I was looking into being ordained, trying to start the candidacy process, that kind of thing. So right after I'd come out, I had got a phone call, and in that phone call, he just simply said, Jay, would you like to come meet with me? We need to talk about candidacy. And I said, okay. And in the back of my mind, I was like, I just came out to a whole youth camp, leadership camp. Obviously, he's going to want to talk about more than just that. And so I get there, and sure enough, after us kind of just making small talk that became awkward over time, he finally just said, I heard this has happened, and I heard that you have declared that you were gay, and that's something that we needed to discuss. And we had a conversation about it, and after after we never really got on the same page, it was hard for him to understand. I don't think that he really realized that it was hard for me to understand at first, but I slowly had to come to the understanding myself. And after years of coming to that understanding, I felt confident in who I was. But to him, it was just, it kind of sounded like he thought maybe it was still just a phase or, what have you. But at the end of the conversation, he told me, well, you have declared this, and you say that you are gay, and by the book of discipline, my hands are tied. There's nothing I can do. And so he kind of just left it at that. He offered to pray with me, and we prayed, and he kind of ushered me out the door, and I left, and we just kind of left it at that. I don't think that he had any true harmful intentions. It was just what he believed, and so I went on about my way, moved off to college, and everything had changed. I got involved still within the church, and my calling to ministry stayed strong, and God actually had a plan for me. I ended up pastoring a church for over 3 years of my college career, and I continue to pastor today. So, it was kind of like, at that moment, it was kind of like a closed door, or essentially a person trying to close a door, but you can't close any doors that God has already opened. So I thought it was interesting, and I think that through that process, I have just learned that obviously when God has a plan for you, there's nothing that's going to be able to stand in the way.
And you had kind of a follow-up conversation with the Bishop of Oklahoma following General Conference 2019, right?
Yes. Yeah. So at General Conference 2019, we had sat and listened, and we remained hopeful that maybe the one church plan would pass, or one of the more affirming plans would pass. And as we were prioritizing plans, it became very evident that the traditional plan was likely to be the plan the greater church would ultimately decide on. And so obviously this created a lot of hurt feelings. LGBTQ people, again, were harmed. And, there was just there seemed like there was just no hope. And after some time, after like taking it all in, I remember being there with a lot of my peers from my college, because we all had went together, and the bishop and the cabinet and other, prominent leaders in the conference came over to just speak with us, us young folk. And they obviously saw how hurt we were, and so they tried to kind of cater to that. They expressed empathy for us and with us, and tried to offer us some words of hope. And the whole time, I just sat in my chair, and I just became so frustrated because I just again thought about all of my LGBTQ friends who have vowed to never walk a foot in the church because of things like this. And I felt like the bishop needed to know that queer people were serving in his in under his charge in Oklahoma. Faithful queer people that have obviously demonstrated a lot of care and passion about their calling. And because of that vote, they were just pushed out. So I thought it was important for the bishop to know that. And so I simply told him, and I told him about myself. I expressed my sexuality to him. I told him that, being gay and trying to live an authentic life in the world, but not within the church, was incredibly hard and harmful and confusing. I expressed to him that I had always hoped to one day have a family, have a husband, a spouse, with children, and, just like any hetero couple, but couldn't do that. I told him about all of these different things that I continued to feel the church limited me from doing. And, I just laid it out there for him to hear. I don't exactly remember everything that I said to him in that moment, but, he heard those words, and I thought it was important for him as the bishop to hear the harm that was created in this vote. Me and the bishop have had a great relationship prior to that. We engaged in racial get on the bus trip, focusing on just the different things that has happened in the civil rights movement. He got to know my nephews, who I've adopted recently, and so we fostered such a great relationship. And so I think that I felt that with that happening, him hearing from a person that he knew kind of well, expressing the hurt that the church has caused and continues to cause, I felt that it would have been strong for him to just hear those words from someone like me.
A theme that we've hit on several previous podcasts is the distinction between welcoming and being affirming. How do you see the difference between those two concepts?
Intentionality. I think intentionality plays a huge role. I think that in churches that I've served and that I've been to or been a part of, I think that they all were welcoming. I think that they wouldn't have turned away anyone for any reason, even if they disagreed with LGBTQ equality or what have you. But a affirming church is intentional about saying LGBTQ people are God's people, LGBTQ people are welcomed in God's church, and LGBTQ plus people should be able to fully participate in all areas of the church where everyone else can serve. And so I think that it's very intentional. I think that's the distinction, because again, churches who are affirming reach out to those who might be outcasted, and says, there's a place for you here, because that's exactly what Jesus did throughout the Gospels. And yeah.
So when you were talking about your experience at General Conference 2019, one of the things that you mentioned was how some of your peers in the LGBTQ community have been so harmed by churches that they point to things like General Conference and are like, I'm done, right? I'm not going back. And from some of my relationships with folks who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, I know that with that harm that churches have caused, there's also distrust and discomfort around anything church. And so even around folks who are people of faith, there can be kind of this wariness almost. So do you find challenges yourself personally within the LGBTQ community, especially as someone who is on this faith leader journey?
Yeah. I mean, I've been encountered several times with, some of them might have even looked at me as like a traitor, maybe someone that, kind of doesn't necessarily fit in with the community, because I'm also part of this community that's creating all this harm to us. And so I think that that's kind of the lens that have experienced. Others are like, wow, this is great. Here we have this queer person who is being bold and, kind of just paving the way for the church to become more inclusive so queer people can participate. So it has been a challenge, and really it's a huge challenge because for me, I personally feel like my calling in ministry is to bridge the gaps between the church and the people that the church continues to harm, be that people of color, be that those with different identities, LGBTQ people. I see my calling as bridging that gap. And so, to kind of have one foot in the church and one foot in the LGBTQ community kind of seems contradicting to some folks. And the challenge comes in where, so often I'll try to talk about church. I'll try to offer a different voice on behalf of the church. And a lot of my peers in the LGBTQ community, aren't having it because of what they see on the news, what they hear from different denominations, and what they've experienced in their own life. A lot of our people are so traumatized by the church, even if they didn't grow up in the church. A lot of them have just experienced so much harm, and it's just something they're like, I have tried this, and I don't think that I can do it again. And so it's kind of hard to overcome that mentality where I try to step in and say, hey, here's this place of faith that you would be fully recognized in, you would be fully loved and cared for. But again, if I do that, I can't, and they decide that they want to be married, and I say, sorry, I can't do that. That's adding another layer of harm. And so it's just incredibly hard to want to see that change happen and want to be part of that change, but also walking the line of not causing additional harm.
What challenges do you find in churches around inclusion? How can churches become more inclusive?
I think that this whole cross-cultural appointment thing that we're kind of trying out a little bit here and there, mostly tied to race, right, can make a huge difference. One example I bring up is the church that I just finished pastoring before I had made the switch to Mosaic United Methodist Church, was a predominantly white, older, cis hetero church, like most of our churches. And here I am, this black gay man, like stepping inside of their church, in their pulpit, bringing a different voice, offering a different word, where they have no choice but to, accept it or leave. Those are the only two options. And so many people in this particular faith community were so dedicated to that specific church that they, weren't leaving. And so over time, after we had fostered relationships, after we grown together to love each other and really just get to know each other, we kind of set our differences aside and just focused on our mission, which, in any church is to bring that love of Christ to other people. And so I say that because it became evident when I was reappointed recently. I had an older congregation member who fit the whole, norms of society. Older white man, married, straight, that kind of thing. We just went to lunch and decided to have some conversations. And he said to me, I'm upset that you're going to Mosaic. Not upset because of where you're going. It has nothing to do with Mosaic. But what he said is, for people like me, for older people that come from this other generation, having you as a pastor has changed my mind a lot on a lot of these issues. And I feel like you going to Mosaic, where, they've already kind of have this general idea of acceptance, you're not able to change other people's minds. You're not able to lead other people into this, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, like this inclusive mindset. And what he said is, we need more leaders like you, positive gay leaders who can change our minds as older generations. And so I think that in becoming more inclusive, it's important for our church, our denomination, and our bishops and our cabinets to become more aware of the intersectionalities that we can create in our churches. Appointing cross-racial, cross-cultural kind of pastors in with these churches to bring about inclusion, to offer a different voice. So many times, it's hard to believe, even for me, so many times I will encounter someone and they'll tell me, you're the first gay person I've actually met. Or, you're the first African American I've truly just had a conversation with. And that happens still today. And so for us to be able to change this, for us to be able to become more inclusive, it's important for us to foster these relationships, and just become open to where the Spirit may lead us, in changing our church dynamics and changing our church culture at large.
What does a full vision of inclusion look like to you? Is it understanding each other or attempting to understand each other? What would you say if you said the perfect full vision of inclusion? What would that look like?
Yeah, so I think that people should be able to hold on to their beliefs and their identities, no matter what they are, but still come together and love each other, have peaceful, civil conversations, so much of what we're missing in our world today, and just kind of see that the way that we perceive the world is different based on how one grew up, based on one's identity of sorts. And so I think that for me, a perfect world of inclusion would just would be us, no matter where we come from in life, no matter if we're conservative or progressive, if we're gay or straight, male or female, all of those things, just for us to come together and realize that we do have our differences, but it's okay to have those differences. And we should just continue to love each other in the midst of it all.
Following up on some of what you've said about getting to know people cross-culturally or in different dynamics, what do you wish people knew about LGBTQ Christians?
Yeah. I wish that people knew that LGBTQ people, although hurt and harmed, are hungry for the gospel just like everyone else. I think if there's anything I could tell people is that, as much as we see LGBTQ people as opposite of what church is or what religion is, as much as people say that that's true, it's not. I mean, obviously, I'm here. There are plenty of LGBTQ people of faith who God has called to ministry. God has called to be the bishop, who God has called to be in every place of the world. And so why would we limit them from participating in the church? So I wish people would know, especially those of Christian faith or of any faith really, that LGBTQ people are part of our family. I mean, they're human just like everyone else, and they deserve to be treated as such.
What is the most important thing that Christians and church members can do to support their LGBTQ plus neighbors, siblings, and community at large?
I always say showing up is a great way to support any person, particularly the LGBTQ community. And when I say that, some people, sometimes they get nervous. They're like, oh, well, I don't know about protesting. I can't do that, or something along those lines. But really, showing up can mean a variety of things. Simply being willing to have an open and honest conversation about sexuality, or having an interest in an LGBTQ person's life, love life, or whatever, without being nosy, of course. But yeah, if we all would just show up, use our gifts and our resources to bridge the gap of inequality and oppression and injustice. Yeah, so we can close those gaps and support our fellow siblings. People seem to think that, we have to do all of these extravagant things. We have to go the, extra mile, but it's simply just being present, being willing to have conversations, no matter how hard they might be, and just stand up for our siblings. I think that those are ways that we can show up for them.
I think that comes back to what you were saying earlier about being intentional, right?
Yeah.
Being an intentional relationship.
Mm-hmm. Intentionality makes the difference, for sure.
Where do you find hope for the future of the church?
Yeah. Well, again, I truly find hope in all of my ancestors, and all of the people like me that are, continuing their legacy. Those who have stood on the front lines of justice, and fought and even risked and lost their lives for a better world that they envisioned. And so I find hope in knowing that I come from a long line of liberators, a long line of justice seekers, and people that did the hard work to get me to where I am today. And going forward, I hope to continue to clear out the path for generations to come. And I think that's why I live so boldly, is because I owe it to my ancestors. They got me to where I am. I'm free to be able to be in this podcast, although some of my siblings aren't. I am free to use my voice, and I think that that's that's where a lot of the hope comes from. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I always, in every situation, no matter what I'm doing, I always love to send a message to our LGBTQ community and just allow them to know that they are wonderfully and fearfully created. They are children of God. They belong in our churches. And no matter how much our siblings in the faith, in the denomination, in the Methodist Church, tried to put a box on God's love, God does not fit in a box. So to our LGBTQ siblings, I just want them to know that they always have a place in the church. And even if the church tries to deny them access, we don't need church buildings and church rules and church procedures to be the church. We can gather anywhere and love each other and love the world as Christ set for us, and following in Christ's footsteps and Christ's example, we can truly make a difference and welcome all people, no matter their walk of life.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if anyone is interested in hearing more of these discussions, you can go back to our archives to this past May, where we had a 3-part series talking to LGBTQ plus people of faith. If you want to know more about more resources you can find, go to the Resist Harm website. This is the month of love for resisting harm. And next month is Lament, the month of March. And the next Resist worship service is on March 1st in Tulsa, Oklahoma, is on March 1st from 5:30 to 6:30 at University United Methodist Church. So if you're interested more in the Resist movement, you can go to the website Resist Harm to find out more about it. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We are located at 1301 South Boston Avenue in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.